The air in the sugar mill hung thick and heavy, a sweet poison that choked the lungs and clung to the skin. For Jonah Carter, it was the smell of another day in hell. But on this day, the fires he was forced to feed would consume more than just sugarcane. They would burn a hole in reality itself, leaving behind only a set of footprints in the ash, leading to a wall that should not exist, and a mystery that would echo through generations. What really happened in the heart of the furnace, and where did Jonah Carter go? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The heart of the sugar mill on the Oakwood plantation was a symphony of damnation, a mechanical beast with a gut of fire and bones of iron. Here, near Vicksburg, Mississippi, in the year 1851, the world was reduced to a singular, oppressive reality. The deafening roar of the massive grinding gears was a constant, a physical pressure against the eardrums that made spoken words impossible and thoughts a struggle. It was a sound that burrowed into a man's skull and stayed there long after the work was done, a phantom grinding that haunted the quiet of the night. Coupled with the noise was the heat, a living entity that radiated in shimmering waves from the great brick furnaces. It was a wet, suffocating heat that baked the air and drew every drop of moisture from a man's body, leaving his skin slick with a mixture of sweat and the fine, sticky dust of processed cane. And beneath it all, the smell, a cloying, sickly sweet perfume of boiling cane syrup that coated the back of the throat and promised a slow, sweet poisoning. It was the smell of wealth being rendered from human misery, and for Jonah Carter it was the smell of his life being burned away, one shovelful at a time. Jonah, a man in his late 20s, was built of the kind of strength that comes from relentless labor. His shoulders were broad, his arms corded with muscle that bunched and coiled with an efficient, practiced grace. Yet his strength was a cage, binding him to this place, to the endless rhythmic task of feeding the furnace. His movements were economical, honed by years of conserving energy for a day that never seemed to end. He would drive the wide-mouthed shovel into the mountain of bagasse, the dry, fibrous pulp left over from the crushed sugarcane, lift the load with a controlled grunt, pivot on his worn-out boots and cast the fuel into the fiery maw of the furnace. The iron door, hot enough to raise blisters on unprotected skin, would swing open, revealing a blinding inferno that pulsed with a hungry orange light. For a moment, the heat would intensify, scorching his eyebrows and tightening the skin on his face. Then the door would clang shut, and the cycle would begin again. Shovel, lift, pivot, feed. It was a dance of despair, and Jonah moved through its steps with the weary resignation of a man whose soul had been worn as smooth as a river stone. Inside his mind, however, a storm raged. While his body performed its robotic task, his thoughts were a torrent of suppressed emotion. He saw the face of his wife, Sarah, her eyes a deep pool of worry and love that gave him a reason to endure the unendurable. He saw the small, bright face of his daughter, Mary, her laughter a sound so pure it felt like a memory from another life. The fierce, protective love he felt for them was a physical ache in his chest, a constant burning reminder of everything he stood to lose, of everything that was already lost to him. That love was intertwined with a simmering, silent hatred for his enslavement, a venom that he had to swallow down every single day. It was a hatred for the chains he could not see but felt in every aching muscle, a hatred for the men who owned his body but could never touch the defiant core of his spirit. And somewhere, buried deep beneath the layers of exhaustion and anger, was a desperate, almost extinguished ember of hope, a foolish, fragile dream of a life where his strength was his own, where his family was safe, and where the air did not taste of sugar and sorrow. The sweat stung his eyes, tracing clean paths through the mask of soot that was permanently ingrained in his skin. The rhythmic clang of his shovel against the furnace's iron lip was the only metronome for his day, a sound that marked the passage of his life in increments of fuel. He watched the firelight dance through the grate, casting monstrous, elongated shadows that writhed and leaped across the brick walls like tormented spirits. In the flickering gloom, the machinery itself seemed to take on a life of its own, the great walking beams rising and falling like the limbs of a colossal insect, the spinning flywheels a blur of hypnotic motion. The entire mill felt like the belly of some great, unholy beast, and he was just one of the morsels it was slowly digesting. The tension on the mill floor, already a palpable force, ratcheted higher with the appearance of the overseer. Mr. Harding was a man carved from cruelty, his face a mask of impatient disdain. He patrolled the floor with a predator's restless energy, his boots echoing on the grimy flagstones. In his hand, he carried a thick leather strap, which he would tap rhythmically against his thigh, a constant, quiet threat that spoke louder than any shout. The mill was behind its production quota, a fact that had curdled Harding's already sour disposition into pure acid. He was pushing the enslaved workers to their breaking point, and worse, he was pushing the machinery beyond its limits, demanding a pace that the groaning iron and straining boilers were not meant to sustain. To Harding, the men and women who toiled in the heat were not people. They were components of the mill, as interchangeable and expendable as any gear or belt. His gaze swept over them, cold and calculating, his mind tallying output and efficiency, never seeing the humanity wilting in the furnace-like heat. He stopped behind Jonah, his shadow falling over him like a shroud. "More fuel, Carter." Harding's voice was sharp, a whip crack of sound that cut through the mechanical din. "Do you think that fire feeds itself? Every minute you waste is $1 lost to the master." Jonah didn't turn. He simply increased his pace, the muscles in his back and shoulders screaming in protest. He could feel Harding's eyes on him, a physical weight of scrutiny. He focused on the shovel, on the pile of bagasse, on the hungry fire. To acknowledge the overseer was to invite his wrath. To argue was to invite the strap. Silence and obedience were the only armor he had. Nearby, an older, wiry man named Elias was meticulously cleaning the massive, grease-caked gears of the primary grinder. Elias was an elder, a man who had survived decades of this life by being observant, quiet, and wise. He had seen overseers come and go, had seen the spirit of strong young men broken on the anvil of this plantation. He communicated with Jonah not with words, but with subtle glances. A slight nod of the head, a shared look that conveyed solidarity and caution. He was a grounding presence in this chaotic hell, a reminder that survival was its own form of resistance. As Harding moved on, his attention drawn to another perceived slacker, Elias's gaze met Jonah's for a fleeting second. It was a look of warning. It was then that Jonah felt it for the first time. It was not a sound, but a feeling, a deep, unsettling vibration that traveled up through the soles of his worn boots and resonated in his bones. It was a low, continuous hum, a thrumming that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the building. He paused, his shovel halfway to the furnace, and looked towards the main boiler. Its massive, riveted iron shell was the heart of the entire operation, the source of the steam that drove the pistons and turned the grinders. On its side was a large, brass-rimmed pressure gauge. Its needle, which normally held steady in the middle of the dial, was trembling. As Jonah watched, it crept higher, ticking almost imperceptibly past the black line that marked the upper limit of safe operation and into the faded red zone beyond. The low hum seemed to grow in intensity, a dissonant note in the mill's mechanical symphony, a groan from the belly of the beast. A brief respite came in the form of a stolen moment. Sarah appeared at the edge of the mill floor, a silhouette against the bright square of the open doorway. She carried a gourd of water, a small act of mercy that was technically forbidden during work hours. She caught his eye, and with a quick glance towards Harding's position at the far end of the room, Jonah moved towards her, his body shielded from the overseer's view by a stack of cane barrels. Their hands touched as he took the gourd, her skin cool against his. Her face was etched with worry, her eyes scanning the groaning, steaming machinery around them. The look they shared was a conversation in itself, a silent exchange of fear, love, and the shared burden of their existence. "Be careful, Jonah," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar. "The mill sounds angry today." He drank deeply, the lukewarm water a balm to his parched throat. He wanted to tell her not to worry, to offer a reassurance he did not feel, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just squeezed her hand, a desperate, fleeting touch. "I will," he promised, the words tasting like a lie in his own mouth. She lingered for a second more, her eyes holding his, and then she was gone, disappearing back into the relative safety of the daylight outside. The brief moment of connection left him feeling more exposed than before. It had resharpened the stakes. He was not just fighting for his own survival, but for theirs. He was fighting for the hope of one day being able to walk with her and Mary in the sun, free from the shadow of the mill. Returning to the furnace, Jonah's mind replayed an old story Elias had once told him. They had been mending a fence line far from the main house, and the old man had spoken of the land itself. He'd said that the land remembers. It remembers the blood that soaks into it, the tears that water it, the pain that is inflicted upon it. And sometimes, Elias had said, the land demands a price for that pain. At the time, Jonah had dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man. But now, feeling the unnatural tremor beneath his feet, hearing the strained groan of the boiler, the story felt chillingly prescient. This mill, built on land that had seen generations of suffering, felt like a monument to that pain. As if summoned by the thought, Elias appeared at his side, ostensibly to inspect a nearby steam pipe. Harding was gone, having stalked off towards the boiling house. The old man didn't look at Jonah, keeping his eyes on the pipe as he spoke, his voice a low murmur. "That iron beast is groaning, son," he said, his words weaving through the din. "An old mule groans like that right before it lays down to die, or kicks the barn to splinters." He tapped the pipe, a hollow, ringing sound. "Harding's pushing her too hard. He's a fool who thinks you can whip a machine the same as a man. A machine don't heal, it just breaks." The old man's words planted a seed of specific, imminent dread in Jonah's heart. This was no longer a vague unease. It was a clear and present danger, a warning from a man who understood the language of suffering, whether it came from flesh or from iron. The vibration in the floorboards was no longer just a hum. It was a countdown. Later that evening, the air in the cramped slave quarters was a different kind of oppressive. The suffocating heat of the mill had been replaced by the cool, damp air of a Mississippi night, but the tension from the day clung to Jonah like the soot on his skin. He sat on the packed earth floor of his small cabin, the space shared with Sarah and their young daughter, Mary. A single tallow candle flickered on a crate, casting long, dancing shadows that made the small room feel even smaller, its walls closing in. In his hands, he held a small block of soft pine and his sharpest whittling knife. He was trying to carve a bird for Mary, a small, simple thing with outstretched wings. The act of creation, of bringing a shape of life from a formless piece of wood, was a quiet rebellion against the destructive, all-consuming nature of his work. Each careful slice of the knife, each curl of wood that fell away was a small piece of himself he was reclaiming from the furnace. Mary, a child of 4 with her mother's bright, curious eyes, was playing near the hearth with a doll made from corn husks. Her quiet chatter was a gentle stream of sound in the otherwise silent cabin, a melody that soothed the raw edges of Jonah's nerves. But even here, in this small sanctuary of family, the anxiety from the mill was a constant, unwelcome guest. He watched his daughter play, a fierce, protective love swelling in his chest with an intensity that was almost painful. It was for her, for the chance that she might one day know a life different from this, that he endured. Yet that same love was the source of his deepest fear. The image of the trembling needle on the pressure gauge was burned into his mind. The low, unnatural hum of the boiler echoed in his ears, a ghost sound that drowned out the chirping of the crickets outside. He felt trapped, caught in a vice between two impossible choices. On one side was the immediate certain threat of Mr. Harding's wrath if he spoke out, a punishment that would be swift and brutal. On the other was the looming catastrophic threat of the boiler, a danger that put not just his own life but the lives of everyone in the mill at risk. He felt a profound sense of powerlessness, a feeling as heavy and suffocating as the sweet air of the mill itself. The sliver of wood in his hand felt fragile, the bird he was carving a symbol of a freedom he could barely imagine. He set the half-finished bird aside, the desire for a simple creative act overwhelmed by the need for answers, for some kind of understanding that might cut through his fear. He needed to talk to Elias. He rose, his joints protesting, and looked at Sarah. She was mending one of Mary's small dresses by the candlelight, her fingers moving with a practiced, steady rhythm. She looked up, her eyes meeting his, and she saw the turmoil there. She didn't ask where he was going, she simply gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of trust, of understanding that he had burdens he had to carry alone. Jonah found Elias sitting on a small, three-legged stool outside his cabin, his back straight, his gaze fixed on the vast, star-dusted canvas of the night sky. The old man seemed to be a part of the night itself, a figure of quiet contemplation carved from the shadows. He didn't seem surprised to see Jonah approach, as if he had been expecting him. Jonah stood for a moment in silence, gathering his thoughts. The sounds of the night, the distant call of a whippoorwill, the hum of insects filling the space between them. "Elias," Jonah began, his voice low, "the things you said today about the mill having a hunger, what did you mean?" Elias did not look at him immediately. He continued to gaze at the stars, his expression unreadable. After a long moment, he patted the ground beside his stool. "Sit, son. This ain't a conversation for a man who's standing." Jonah sank to the ground, the cool earth a welcome relief. Elias finally turned his head, his eyes, even in the darkness, seeming to hold a deep, ancient light. "You felt it too, didn't you? The shaking in the ground, the wrongness." It wasn't a question. Jonah nodded. "It feels like the whole building is sick." "Sick is one word for it," Elias said, his voice a dry rustle like autumn leaves. He gestured with a gnarled hand towards the darkness where the main house and the mill lay hidden. "This plantation, this land, it's old. Older than the master's family, older than the cotton and the cane. Before they brought us here in chains, this was Choctaw land, and they knew. They knew there were places you don't build, places where the earth is thin, where echoes of things that happened long ago get trapped and play over and over." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "They say the spot where that mill stands, they avoided it. Said it was a place of cold spots and strange sounds, a place where the world wasn't stitched together quite right." Jonah listened, his skepticism warring with the cold dread that Elias's words stirred within him. He had heard whispers of such things, old tales told in the dark, but had always dismissed them. "Then the master's grandfather came," Elias continued, his voice dropping lower. "He didn't listen. He saw a hill, a creek for water, and he built his fortune. He built it with the lives of our people. Men died clearing this land. They died digging the foundations, they died raising the walls of that mill, brick by heavy brick. Women wept until the ground was salt, and for 50 years since it's been the same. We've fed that place with our sweat, our blood, our years. Every brick is soaked in our sorrow, Jonah. Every gear is greased with our pain. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into Jonah's. This ain't just iron and steam, boy. It's a monument to our pain, fed by our sweat and blood for years. A hungry thing gets reckless. It don't know the difference between cane and bone. It just wants to be fed. The words hung in the air, chilling Jonah to the core. It transformed the problem from a simple mechanical failure into something far more terrifying, something ancient and alive. The mill wasn't just breaking, it was waking up. It was a hungry ghost, and they were all trapped inside it. The next morning, the feeling of wrongness had intensified. The vibration was no longer a subtle hum felt through the soles of the feet. It was a constant, jarring shudder that ran through the entire structure. The air itself seemed to thrum with a low, menacing energy. The metallic symphony of the mill was now horribly off-key, punctuated by shrieks and groans from the overstrained machinery. Jonah worked with a grim, fatalistic focus, his body moving on autopilot while his mind was a maelstrom of fear. He kept his eyes on his work, avoiding the pressure gauge, avoiding the thought of what was coming. The first sign of the breaking came with a sudden, violent hiss. A small valve on a feeder pipe, unable to withstand the immense pressure, burst. A jet of scalding white steam shot across the floor with the force of a cannonball. It narrowly missed a young slave named Caleb, who was hauling a load of raw cane nearby. The steam jet struck the brick wall behind him, blasting away soot and mortar in a cloud of dust and vapor. The incident caused a brief, panicked chaos. Men yelled and scrambled back, their eyes wide with terror. Caleb, a young man of about 18, was more volatile and cynical than Jonah, his spirit not yet worn down into quiet resilience. The near miss left him trembling, his face pale with a mixture of terror and furious indignation. He stood frozen for a moment, staring at the hissing pipe, before dropping his load of cane with a clatter. Harding was on him in an instant, his face purple with rage at the interruption. "Get back to it!" he roared, his voice cracking with fury. He brought the leather strap down hard across Caleb's back. The sound was a sickening crack that echoed in the suddenly quieter mill. Caleb cried out, stumbling forward, "You clumsy fool! I'll teach you to stand around gawking!" Harding raised the strap again. Something inside Jonah snapped. The injustice of it, the sheer, blind stupidity of punishing a man for a mechanical failure that Harding himself had caused, was too much to bear. The fear that had held him silent was burned away by a sudden hot surge of anger. He dropped his shovel, the clang of it hitting the stone floor, turning heads. He stepped forward, placing himself between Harding and Caleb. "Sir," Jonah's voice was steady, clear and loud enough to be heard over the hissing steam and the groaning gears. "It wasn't his fault." Harding froze, his arm still raised, his eyes wide with disbelief at this open act of defiance. He slowly lowered his arm and turned his full venomous attention on Jonah. "The pressure is too high," Jonah continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke the truth he had been suppressing. He pointed a trembling but determined finger towards the main boiler. "That gauge, it's in the red. The boiler is going to fail." For a moment there was a stunned silence, broken only by the machinery's death rattle. The other slaves stared, their faces a mixture of terror and awe. No one spoke to Harding like this. No one. Harding's face, which had been flushed with anger, slowly drained of color, replaced by a cold, reptilian fury. He took a slow step towards Jonah until his face was inches away. His breath was hot and foul. "Are you the master engineer now, Carter?" he hissed, his voice dangerously soft. "Are you paid to think? Or are you paid to shovel?" He didn't wait for an answer. "I tell you when the pressure is too high," he snarled, his voice rising to a shout again. "I tell you what to do and when to do it. Now get back to work before I teach you a lesson about insubordination you will never forget." With a final explosive burst of rage, Harding shoved Jonah with all his might. Jonah stumbled backward, his boots scraping on the grimy floor, catching his balance just before he fell. The shove was not just a physical act. It was a public humiliation, a violent reassertion of dominance. Harding stood there, breathing heavily, his chest puffed out, daring Jonah to say another word. Jonah stood his ground, his fists clenched at his sides, his heart hammering against his ribs. He met the overseer's hateful glare, and in that moment, the last ember of hope for a reasonable outcome died. He had spoken the truth, had tried to prevent a disaster, and he had been dismissed, humiliated, and threatened for it. His sense of powerlessness was now absolute. He looked past Harding, at the great trembling boiler, at the needle pressed hard into the red, and the fear that had been a churning sea inside him solidified into a grim, cold certainty. Disaster was no longer a possibility, it was an inevitability. It was coming, and there was nothing he or anyone else could do to stop it. He turned without another word and walked back towards the furnace, the eyes of every man in the mill on his back. He picked up his shovel, the metal cool against his sweating palms. The vibration in the floor was a living thing now, a frantic heartbeat counting down the final seconds. The final hour arrived without fanfare, indistinguishable at first from the countless hours of torment that had preceded it. The narrative of the day, of Jonah's life, seemed to slow down, the seconds stretching into thick, syrupy moments of heightened perception. The heat was no longer just an environmental condition. It was a physical presence, a suffocating blanket woven from steam and fire that pressed down on the shoulders and constricted the chest. It was a predator, stalking the air in a shimmering, visible haze that distorted the world, making the far walls of the mill ripple and dance as if seen through water. The iron of the furnace Jonah tended had ceased to be black. It now glowed with a dull, angry red, a blush of imminent violence that radiated a heat so intense it felt as though it were cooking him from the inside out. The cacophony of the mill had reached its crescendo, a disorienting wall of sound that made thought impossible. The grinding of the gears, the shriek of metal on metal, the roar of the furnace, it all merged into a single overwhelming roar, a mechanical scream that vibrated in Jonah's teeth and rattled his bones. His movements became robotic, a testament to the body's ability to function even after the mind has begun to retreat. His muscles, screaming in protest, continued their grim rhythm: shovel, lift, pivot, feed. He was profoundly dehydrated, his tongue thick and dry in his mouth, and a dull, pounding headache had taken root at the base of his skull, a drumbeat that matched the frantic, shuddering pulse of the mill itself. A strange sense of detachment washed over him. He felt as if he were floating somewhere near the ceiling, looking down at the soot-stained puppet of his own body as it went through its paces. He was a ghost feeding a machine, his spirit already beginning to unmoor itself from the flesh that had been its prison for so long. His thoughts, once a raging storm, became fragmented, like shards of a broken mirror reflecting brief, brilliant images against the encroaching darkness. He saw Sarah's face not as she was now, worn with worry and hardship, but as she had been when he first met her, her laughter bright and easy under the shade of a magnolia tree. The memory was so vivid, so pure, it was a physical pain, a stab of loss for a life they never had. He saw his daughter, Mary, her small hand clutching his finger, her face full of unquestioning love. The image was a shield, the only thing that mattered in this collapsing world. He saw her safe. He saw her free. He saw her growing old in a world without the smell of burning sugar and the crack of a whip. The vision was a prayer, a final desperate plea sent out into the roaring chaos. Then Elias's words echoed in the silent chambers of his mind, cutting through the noise with the clarity of a prophet's warning. A hungry thing gets reckless. He looked at the glowing furnace, at the trembling iron plates of the boiler, and he understood. This was not a machine breaking, it was a creature lashing out. It was the accumulated pain of generations, a monstrous entity of iron and anguish finally shaking itself awake. And with that understanding, the fear that had been his constant companion simply evaporated. It was replaced by a profound and unsettling calm. The quiet resignation of a man who has walked to the edge of a cliff and accepted the inevitability of the fall. He was no longer afraid. He was no longer angry. He was just waiting. The world had been reduced to this single final moment, and his only remaining role was to bear witness. With a slow, deliberate motion that felt both eternal and instantaneous, he drove his shovel into the bagasse one last time. He lifted the load, his muscles performing the familiar action with a grace that belied the chaos around them. As he pivoted, his eyes were drawn as if by a magnet to the brass-rimmed pressure gauge on the main boiler. The needle was no longer trembling. It was pressed hard against the small metal stopper at the far end of the red zone, bent slightly from the impossible force. A silent scream of metal pushed beyond its absolute limit. At that exact moment, the low, bone-jarring hum that had vibrated through the floorboards all day began to change. It rose in pitch, climbing rapidly from a groan to a whine, and then to a piercing high-frequency shriek that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and vibrate directly inside his skull. It was the sound of reality tearing at the seams. Across the vast, hazy room, Harding was still screaming. His face contorted as he berated a group of workers near the cane press, his words lost in the rising shriek. He was oblivious, a king of a collapsing kingdom, issuing orders to shadows. Near the main gears, Elias had stopped his work. He stood frozen, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated dread, his eyes fixed not on Jonah but on the massive, shuddering shell of the main boiler. He knew what was coming. He had been waiting for it his whole life. Jonah turned back to the furnace, the load of fuel still balanced on his shovel. He was facing the glowing iron door, the source of the blinding heat, the epicenter of the rising shriek. And then it happened. It was not an explosion. An explosion is a release, a violent expansion of force and sound and fire. This was the opposite. It was an implosion. From the heart of the furnace that Jonah was tending, there was a blinding, silent flash of pure white light. It was not the orange of fire or the yellow of flame. It was a clean, sterile, absolute white that bleached all color from the world. For a single eternal second, every sound in the universe was completely and utterly extinguished. The deafening roar of the furnace, the grinding of the gears, the high-pitched shriek, Harding's distant, unheard shouting, it all vanished into a profound, bottomless vacuum of silence. It was a silence so total it was a physical presence, a pressure wave not of force but of its absolute absence. The very air in the mill seemed to solidify. The millions of dust motes and tiny fibers of cane that danced in the air froze in place, suspended in the white, silent moment like insects in amber. The fire in the furnace did not explode outwards, it collapsed inwards. The white light seemed to suck the very heat and energy from the room into itself, a miniature star going supernova in reverse, pulling the world into its core. Jonah, standing at the epicenter of this silent apocalypse, was silhouetted against the impossible light, his body a dark, still shape on the verge of dissolution. The white light vanished as quickly as it had appeared, plunging the mill into a sudden, disorienting semi-darkness. The only illumination came from the faint gray light of the doorways and the high, grimy windows. The absolute silence held for another heartbeat, a sacred, terrifying stillness that felt as though it might last forever. Then the silence was broken. It was not broken by a scream or a crash, but by a deep, guttural, resonant thump that came from the heart of the now darkened main boiler. It was the sound of a giant's heart stopping, a final convulsive beat. This was followed by an eerie, drawn-out symphony of settling metal, the groans and pings of cooling iron, the sigh of pipes releasing their last breath of steam. And from the open, dark maw of the furnace where Jonah had stood, a thick, heavy cloud of gray ash as fine as powder began to billow out. It did not erupt. It flowed, a lazy, silent river of dust that poured onto the floor and spread outwards, blanketing everything in a soft, uniform shroud of gray. For Jonah, the world simply ceased to exist. The moment the white light flashed, his consciousness was torn from its moorings. There was no pain, no fear, just a profound and overwhelming disorientation. The narrative of his senses shattered. He experienced a swirling vortex of light and shadow, a sensation of being pulled and stretched in all directions at once, his very atoms seeming to come undone. It was a feeling of falling upwards and rising downwards simultaneously, of being turned inside out and scattered to the winds. It was the feeling of a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for eternity. It was the feeling of a door opening onto a place that had no name. And then, nothing. The perspective, which had been tied so tightly to Jonah's experience, pulled away, leaving his fate an unanswered question hanging in the ash-filled air. The camera of the mind panned back, showing the scene from a distance, a silent gray diorama of the immediate aftermath, a world without its central character. The men in the mill who had been thrown to the ground by the silent pressure wave were now just shapes in the gloom, unmoving. Their world changed forever in a moment of impossible silence. The world returned not with a bang, but with a soft, pervasive whisper. It was the sound of the ash, a million tiny particles settling on every surface, a gentle, continuous sigh from the ghost of the furnace. For the men scattered across the mill floor, consciousness seeped back in slowly, a sluggish tide pushing against the shock that had thrown them into darkness. The first sensation was the ash itself. It was in their mouths, a gritty, tasteless paste. It was in their nostrils, making each breath a thick, labored effort. It coated their skin, their hair, their clothes, transforming them into gray, ghostly statues of themselves. The oppressive, suffocating heat was gone, replaced by a strange, unnatural cold that seemed to emanate not from the air, but from the very iron and brick of the mill. One of the first to stir was Elias. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, his old bones protesting, his mind clear and sharp despite the chaos. He coughed, a dry, hacking sound that was shockingly loud in the profound stillness, spitting a dark paste of ash and saliva onto the floor. His face, caked in the gray powder, was a mask of grim resolve. His immediate concern was not for himself, but for the others. He got to his feet, his movements slow but steady, and began to move through the hazy gloom. He was a shepherd in a flock of stunned sheep, his low, steady voice cutting through the daze. "Get up, son. Can you stand? Check on the man next to you." He helped a young man to his feet, patting the dust from his shoulders, his touch both a comfort and a command. Across the room, Mr. Harding was on his hands and knees, his body heaving as he retched. The overseer, the man of whip and command, was gone. In his place was a dazed, bewildered creature. His authority vanished in the silent flash of light. He looked around the mill, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. The silence was what broke him. His entire world, his entire sense of power was built on the noise, the roar, the constant brutal rhythm of production. This stillness was an abomination, a language he could not speak, a power he could not command. He shook his head, trying to clear the ringing in his ears, but the ringing wasn't there. There was only the soft, whispering ash. Near the spot where the steam pipe had burst, Caleb was frozen. He hadn't been knocked down, he had simply been locked in place by sheer terror. He stood ramrod straight, his arms limp at his sides, his eyes fixed on the dark open mouth of the furnace from which the ash still lazily poured. His face, a pale oval in the gray gloom, was a canvas of pure, unthinking horror. He had seen the light, felt the silence, and his mind had simply shut down, unable to process the sensory contradiction of an event so powerful yet so utterly soundless. He was a statue of fear, a monument to the moment the world had stopped making sense. Instinct, deep and ingrained, is a powerful force. For a man like Harding, whose identity was woven from the threads of control, that instinct was to re-establish order, even when the world had fallen into chaos. He stumbled to his feet, swaying, his face a mess of soot and vomit. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, leaving a clean streak across his gray-caked skin. His voice, when it came, was not the familiar whip-crack of command, but a dry, cracking rasp, a pale imitation of his former power. "Report," he croaked, the words swallowed by the sound-deadening ash. He tried again, forcing more air from his lungs. "Everyone! Sound off! Where is everyone?" Slowly, hesitantly, the survivors began to respond. A voice from the shadows near the grinders called out, "Marcus, here!" Another, closer to the door, answered, "Joseph, I'm here, sir." The names came one by one, muffled and strange, voices robbed of their usual timbre by the thick air. It was a roll call of ghosts in a graveyard of industry. As the names were called, a new kind of dread began to form, a specific and terrible anxiety that grew with each name spoken. It was the fear of the name that would not be spoken. The men looked around, their eyes adjusting to the gloom, counting the gray figures rising from the floor, their minds tallying the living. Elias, who had been helping a man with a burn on his arm, straightened up. He had been keeping his own count. He looked towards the silent furnace, then back at the stumbling, pathetic figure of the overseer. His voice was not loud, but it carried with the weight of certainty, cutting through the last of the roll call. "It's Jonah," he said, his tone flat and final. "He's not answered." He paused, letting the truth land with the soft, heavy finality of the settling ash. He was at the furnace. Every eye in the mill turned as one. They looked towards the dark square opening in the brickwork at the far end of the room. The place that had, moments before, been the center of a roaring inferno was now just a black hole, silently belching a lazy, thinning plume of gray dust. The fire was out. The terrible, life-giving, life-taking heat was gone. The area around the furnace, once the hottest place in the state of Mississippi, now seemed to be the source of the unnatural cold that was creeping into the bones of every man present. The space where Jonah Carter had stood was now a void, and the silence that filled the mill suddenly felt like a eulogy. A search began, but it was a hesitant, half-hearted affair. What was there to search for? The assumption was immediate and grim. No man could have survived whatever had happened at the heart of that furnace. He was gone, consumed, turned into the very ash that now coated their tongues. Still they called his name, a ritual of denial against the obvious. Jonah Carter. Their voices echoed strangely in the acoustically dead space, flat and bodiless, as if the ash were swallowing the sound. They shuffled through the thick gray carpet, their movements slow and respectful, creating swirling patterns in the dust. They were looking for a body, or a piece of a body, something to confirm their grief, to give a shape to their loss. Caleb had finally been jolted from his terrified paralysis by Elias's words. The name, Jonah, seemed to unlock his frozen limbs. He had seen Jonah defy Harding. He had seen him walk back to that furnace with a look of grim acceptance on his face. Driven by a morbid curiosity that was stronger than his fear, He began to walk cautiously towards the furnace, his boots making soft, deep impressions in the thick layer of ash. The cold intensified with every step, a palpable physical presence that seemed to push against him. He kept his eyes on the dark opening, half expecting to see a charred shape, a blackened bone, some terrible proof of Jonah's fate. He was about 10 feet from the furnace when he stopped. His breath caught in his throat, a sharp, painful gasp that was loud in the stillness. He stared at the floor, his mind refusing to believe what his eyes were seeing. He tried to speak, but only a choked sound came out. He raised a trembling hand, his finger pointing downwards. "Look!" The word was a whisper, a thread of sound, but in the dead silence of the mill it was as clear as a scream. Elias and a few others turned to him. They saw his pale, terrified face, his pointing finger, and they followed his gaze. They moved closer, their own steps slowing as they saw it. There, in the pristine, undisturbed carpet of gray ash, was a single, perfect set of footprints. They were not the frantic, sliding marks of a man trying to escape. They were not the deep, stumbling tracks of someone caught in a blast. They were the firm, clear, and distinct impressions of a man walking. The tread of worn-out work boots was perfectly preserved in the fine powder. And they began directly in front of the open, cold door of the furnace, at the very spot where Jonah Carter had been standing when the world went silent. A ripple of shock and profound confusion spread through the small group of men. It was a shock that went deeper than the silent implosion itself. The initial simple grief for a lost friend, a fellow sufferer, was instantly replaced by a chilling and terrifying mystery. This made no sense. The ash had billowed out from the furnace, covering everything. For footprints to be on top of the ash, a man would have had to walk there after the event. But the print started at the furnace itself. It was impossible. There was no explosion, no outward blast of fire that could have thrown him clear. Yet the furnace was cold, the fire was gone, and Jonah was missing. All that was left was this impossible, inexplicable trail. The footprints were not a clue to where Jonah had gone. They were a question mark burned into the fabric of reality itself. A calm, deliberate path leading away from an event that should have meant only violent, instantaneous death. The men stared, their minds grappling with a truth their senses could not deny, but their understanding could not accept. Jonah Carter had not been consumed by the fire. He had, it seemed, simply walked out of it. A small, hesitant group, bound by a mixture of morbid curiosity and a desperate need for answers, began to follow the impossible path. Harding, his face a pale, slack mask of confusion, took the lead. It was not an act of authority, but of compulsion. As a man who bent the world to his will through force and intimidation, this silent, inexplicable event was a personal affront to his reality. He had to find the trick, the rational explanation that would restore the predictable order of his universe. He walked with a stiff, jerky gait, his eyes scanning not just the footprints, but the ceiling for hidden spouts, the walls for secret panels, his mind churning through frantic, nonsensical theories of elaborate pranks or mass hysteria. Behind him, Elias followed. The old man had found a lantern somewhere in the gloom, its single steady flame a small point of warm, golden light in the vast, cold gray. He held it aloft, not to search for tricks, but to illuminate the path, to bear witness. His expression was not one of fear, but of a deep, somber reverence. He walked with a slow, measured pace, his eyes fixed on the footprints as if they were sacred scripture. He was not following a man. He was following a miracle, and his every step was an act of devotion. Trailing behind them were Caleb and 2 other slaves, their figures huddled close together for comfort. They were a chorus of frightened whispers and sharp, indrawn breaths. Every detail of the scene was a new source of terror for them. The unnatural cold, the thick, sound-deadening silence, and now this, a ghost's promenade through the ruins of their world. They followed not out of a need for answers, but because the thought of being left alone in the vast, silent mill was even more terrifying than discovering where the path might lead. The procession moved across the floor, a small island of human warmth in an ocean of cold ash. The footprints themselves were unnervingly perfect. They were spaced with the calm, deliberate rhythm of a man on a Sunday stroll. There was no sign of haste, no panic, no deviation. The path led in a perfectly straight line away from the furnace, a line as true as if drawn with a ruler. It did not curve around a fallen stack of cane barrels. The prince went right up to the edge and continued on the other side, as if the obstacle had been nothing but a shadow. At one point, the line intersected a small pile of spilled raw sugarcane that had been scattered during the initial panic. Harding paused, a flicker of triumph in his eyes, expecting the trail to be broken. But it was not. The footprints were there, pressed into the ash that lay on top of the cane, the vegetable matter compressed beneath the impression as if it had no more substance than the dust itself. The walker had been oblivious to any and all obstacles. Harding's mind, a blunt instrument of logic and violence, began to fracture. A prank? Impossible. The ash was a pristine, unbroken blanket. No one could have entered the mill, laid these tracks, and left without disturbing the dust. A trick of the light? He squinted, his eyes watering from the strain and the fine particles in the air, but the impressions remained, solid and undeniable. He felt his worldview, a simple, brutal structure built on the predictable physics of cause and effect of whip and flesh, beginning to crumble. The silence, the cold, the memory of that soundless, all-consuming flash of light, it all defied the laws he understood. With every step he took along that impossible trail, he felt his sanity, his very sense of self, slipping away like sand through his fingers. He was a captain on a ship that had sailed off the edge of the map, and the sea monsters were real. The line of footprints led them across the entire width of the main mill floor, a distance of perhaps 50 feet. It led them past the silent, motionless grinders, past the great still flywheel, towards the massive, solid brick wall that formed the northern foundation of the building. This wall was a testament to the plantation's history, built by the first generation of slaves brought to this land. It was made of dark river mud bricks, thick and ancient. Its mortar hardened over decades into a substance as unyielding as the stone it was built upon. It was a load-bearing wall, a bulwark against the hillside the mill was dug into, and it had no doors, no windows, no openings of any kind. It was the end of the line. As the small group approached the wall, a sense of tense anticlimax began to settle over them. This surely was the end of the trail. They expected the footprints to stop, to show a man turning in confusion, or perhaps the scuffed, frantic marks of someone clawing at the unyielding brick. The mystery of Jonah's disappearance would remain, but at least it would be contained within the known dimensions of the room. It would be a story ending in a question mark, but a question mark written on a solid, understandable surface. They slowed, their steps becoming more hesitant as they neared the wall. Harding was breathing heavily now, his chest hitching with a mixture of dread and a desperate, fading hope for a logical conclusion. Elias held the lantern high, its light casting their elongated, dancing shadows against the vast brick expanse. The footprints did not stop. They did not turn. The trail continued unwavering right up to the very base of the brickwork. The final print on the floor was a perfect, clear impression, the toe of the boot a mere inch from the cold, solid wall. The path had reached a dead end. Elias, his face a mask of profound concentration, knelt at the base of the wall. The cracking of his old knees was a shockingly loud sound in the dead silence. He lowered the lantern, its golden light pooling around the final footprint on the floor. The men crowded behind him, peering over his shoulder, their breath misting in the cold air. The detail in the ash was exquisite. They could see the worn-down pattern on the heel of Jonah's boot, the faint impression of a crack that ran across the sole. It was undeniably his. Then with a slow, deliberate movement, Elias raised the lantern. The beam of light began to travel up the vertical face of the wall, illuminating the dark, soot-stained bricks. The men behind him held their breath, a collective, silent gasp of anticipation. The light climbed, 1 foot, 2 feet, and then it caught something. A sharp, unified cry of disbelief and terror erupted from Caleb and the others. Harding made a choked, strangled sound, as if he had been punched in the gut. For there, on the vertical surface of the solid brick wall, about a foot from the floor, was another perfect footprint. It was not a smudge of ash. It was not a scuff mark. It was an impression, a clear, distinct footprint, the same size, the same shape, with the same cracked sole pressed into the hard brick and the layers of soot, as if the wall had, for a moment, possessed the consistency of wet clay. The ash, which should have fallen away, clung to the edges of the indentation, defining its impossible shape. Elias's hand did not tremble. He raised the lantern higher. The beam continued its slow ascent up the wall. 4 feet, 5 feet, and there it found another one, the final footprint. It was just as clear, just as perfect, just as impossible as the one below it. The trail did not end at the wall. It went up the wall, and then it stopped in the middle of a solid, unyielding surface, leading to absolutely, unequivocally nowhere. The image burned itself into their minds, the clear, unmistakable tread of Jonah's boot pressed into hard, solid brick. It was not a mark. It was a displacement of matter, a physical violation of every law of nature they had ever known. Caleb, his voice a reedy whisper of pure, undiluted terror, finally gave voice to the horror they all felt. He walked into the wall. He stammered, his eyes wide and glassy. The devil took him straight to hell. But Elias, still kneeling, his face illuminated from below by the lantern's glow, shook his head slowly. His voice, when he spoke, was filled with a different emotion entirely. It was not fear. It was not horror. It was a profound, soul-shaking awe. Or, he whispered, his words a prayer in the hallowed silence, the Lord opened a door. Harding, the man of iron and order, could not accept either explanation. His mind, shattered and reeling, clung to one last shred of empirical reality. He had to touch it. He had to prove it was a trick. He stumbled forward, pushing past Elias, his hand outstretched, trembling violently. He reached up, his fingers stretching towards the highest footprint. He did not touch the print itself, but the brick around it. His fingertips made contact with the wall. It was cold. It was hard. It was solid, unyielding brick and mortar. There was no give, no hidden mechanism, no illusion. It was real. The final fragile thread of his sanity snapped. A low, animalistic moan escaped his lips. His body, which had been held rigid by a desperate denial, went limp. He collapsed to his knees in the thick ash. The last vestiges of his authority, his certainty, and his understanding of the world shattering against the impossible truth before him. He knelt there, a broken man in a ruined mill, staring at a footprint in a solid wall, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs of a man who has looked into the abyss and seen it look back. The days that followed the silence were a time of profound and unnerving quiet. The Oakwood Plantation, a place that had always run on a rhythm of noise and brutal efficiency, was thrown into turmoil. The sugar mill stood inert and cold, a dead giant on the landscape, its smokestack no longer breathing its sweet, poisonous smoke into the Mississippi sky. The news of the shutdown and the bizarre, unbelievable story that accompanied it traveled fast, reaching the ears of the plantation's owner in his opulent New Orleans townhouse. Alistair Beaumont arrived a week later, his carriage throwing up dust as it thundered up the long drive. He was not a man like Harding, whose cruelty was born of proximity and petty power. Beaumont was a man of ledgers and shipping manifests, a creature of cold, distant profit. His fury was not hot, but glacial. He was furious at the loss of production, at the disruption to his meticulously calculated schedules, and most of all at the sheer infuriating irrationality of the reports he had received. He brought with him men from Vicksburg, self-proclaimed engineers and experts, men with slide rules and levels who believed the universe was a machine that could be understood and, if necessary, repaired. They descended upon the silent mill like priests of a rational God, determined to exorcise the ghost of impossibility. They found a world that refused to conform to their logic. They examined the main boiler, finding it ruptured, yes, but in a way that made no sense. The metal was warped inward, not outward, as if from a colossal external pressure, not an internal explosion. The rupture could not explain the silent implosion, nor could it account for the profound, lingering cold that still clung to the building's core. They collected samples of the gray ash, subjecting it to chemical analysis, only to find it was nothing more than the supercombusted particulate of sugarcane and wood, utterly ordinary. They spent hours interviewing the witnesses. They questioned the slaves one by one, their tone a mixture of condescension and impatience, dismissing their unanimous testimony as a coordinated lie, a product of superstitious minds and a shared desire to avoid work. But they could not shake the consistency of the story. The shared memory of the silent white light, the inward collapse of sound, the footprints. Their greatest obstacle, however, was Harding. The former overseer was a babbling, broken man. They found him confined to a small room, his eyes wide with a permanent terror, his hands trembling. He told them the story over and over, his voice a hoarse whisper, describing the footprints on the wall with a chilling, lucid detail that his shattered mind clung to like a piece of wreckage. The experts left him shaking their heads, diagnosing him with madness brought on by the shock of a simple boiler failure. Finally, under Beaumont's impatient command, they turned their attention to the north wall. The section of brick with the impossible footprints was meticulously examined. The engineers tapped it with hammers, listening for hollow spaces. They scraped at the mortar, analyzing its composition. They found nothing but solid, well-laid brick and packed earth behind it. Frustrated and furious, Beaumont gave the order. "Tear it down," he commanded, his voice echoing in the cold, silent space. "Tear the whole damn thing down. I want to see what's behind it." The work was hard and loud, a violent intrusion into the mill's hallowed quiet. Using sledgehammers and crowbars, a team of slaves, under the watchful eyes of the Vicksburg men, began the demolition. Brick by brick, the wall that Jonah's path had ended on was dismantled. The men worked with a grim energy, a part of them hoping to find a secret, a tunnel, a hidden passage, anything that would restore sense to the world. But as the opening grew, it revealed nothing. Behind the thick brickwork was only the dark, damp, packed earth of the hillside, held back by the mill's original stone foundation. There were no tunnels. There were no caves. There was nothing. The wall was exactly what it appeared to be, a solid, impenetrable barrier. The demolition crew stood in the rubble, their chests heaving, staring at the blank, empty space where a miracle had occurred. The wall was eventually rebuilt, a scar of new bright red brick on the old dark structure. The mystery remained, sealed but not solved. Harding was dismissed, sent away to live with a distant relative. His story disbelieved by anyone who had not stood in the ash and seen the path for themselves. In the quiet that followed, as the mill was slowly repaired and the brutal rhythm of the plantation was re-established, a new thing was born. The story of Jonah Carter, which had been a source of terror and confusion, began to change. It spread from Oakwood to the surrounding plantations, carried by whispers in the dead of night, a secret currency traded between the enslaved. It was a story told in hushed tones in the dark of the cabins, a spark of light in a world of overwhelming darkness. And with each telling, its meaning grew and transformed. It ceased to be a story of horror and became a powerful piece of folklore, a symbol of miraculous escape. For the enslaved population, Jonah was not a victim. He was not taken by the devil, nor was he consumed by a random industrial accident. Jonah, they whispered, had transcended. He had found a way out, a path that was not the North Star or the treacherous swamps, a path that their masters, with all their maps and guns and logic, could not comprehend or control. He had walked through the fire and into a wall, not as a prisoner but as a traveler stepping through a door. Walking Jonah's path became a quiet expression, a piece of secret language. It was used to describe a moment of impossible luck, a narrow escape from the whip, a sudden unexplainable recovery from sickness. It meant finding a way where there was no way, a moment of divine intervention in a world that seemed godless. Elias, the old man who had seen it all, became the official keeper of the story. He understood its power, its importance. He ensured the details were not lost to fanciful embellishment. When he told the story, it was not a ghost story meant to frighten children. He told it as a testament, a gospel of quiet resistance. He spoke of Jonah's defiance, of his calm acceptance, and of the path that had opened for him. He told it as proof that the Spirit was more powerful than iron, that faith was more solid than brick. Caleb, the young cynic who had once scoffed at the old stories, was transformed. The terror he had felt had curdled into a profound respect. He no longer feared the supernatural, he revered it. He came to believe with an unshakable certainty that there were forces in the world, ancient and deep, that moved according to laws far older and more powerful than the master's whip or the overseer's rage. The event had not broken his mind, it had opened it. The narrative of time flows on, a relentless river, and 20 years is but a ripple in its current. The year is now 1871. The world has been broken and remade. The war came and went, a storm of fire and blood that swept away the old order. The chains were broken. The mill at Oakwood, long since abandoned after the war rendered it unprofitable, is now a crumbling ruin, a brick skeleton being slowly reclaimed by kudzu and ivy. Its roof has collapsed in places, allowing shafts of sunlight to pierce the gloom, illuminating the rust-red husks of the old machinery. It is a monument to a dead world. Under the shade of a great sprawling oak tree not far from the ruins sits Elias. He is a very old man now, his skin a road map of wrinkles, his body frail, but his eyes still hold the same deep, quiet light. He is a free man, a fact that is still a source of quiet, daily wonder to him. He is surrounded by a small group of children, their faces bright and attentive, their lives untouched by the horrors he has known. Among them sits a grown woman in her mid-20s, her hands resting on the shoulders of her own young son. It is Mary, Jonah's daughter. She has her father's strong jaw and her mother's deep, thoughtful eyes. She has heard this story before many times, but she listens as if for the first time, her gaze fixed on the old man's face. Elias's voice is raspy now, thin as autumn leaves, but it is firm, imbued with the unshakable authority of a witness. He is telling the story of Jonah's path. They looked for him after, Elias says, his gaze distant, seeing a past the children can only imagine. The master, Beaumont, he had men search the woods, drag the river. They thought he'd run. They thought he'd somehow tricked 'em all and was making his way north, but they was looking in the wrong place. He leans forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that draws the children closer. He looks directly at Mary, his eyes locking with hers. Your father, child. He didn't run. He walked. The old man's voice gains a sudden strength, a resonant power that seems to defy his frail frame. He walked a path that wasn't there and left his steps behind to tell us that the walls they build to hold us in, the ones you can see and the ones you can't, they ain't as solid as they look. The story ends. A gentle breeze rustles the leaves of the oak tree, the only sound in the peaceful afternoon. Mary looks away from Elias, her gaze traveling across the field to the ruins of the mill. The sun is setting, casting long shadows and bathing the world in a warm, golden light. The light strikes the rebuilt section of the northern wall, the newer bricks glowing a fiery red. For a brief, breathtaking moment, as the light hits it just so, the wall seems to shimmer, to lose its solidity. It wavers in the evening haze, appearing for a fleeting second not as a barrier of brick and mortar, but as a curtain of heat, a shimmering doorway to somewhere else. The illusion passes, and the wall is just a wall again. But Mary smiles, a small, secret smile. The legend of her father, Jonah Carter, is not a story of loss. It is not a memory of a man who vanished. It is the founding of a new kind of faith, a quiet, resilient belief passed down through generations that even in the most hopeless of circumstances, in the very heart of the furnace, a path can be made, leaving only footprints in the ashes as proof.